Okay, well, I mean, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to try and talk about trends in the middle class. And this poster actually comes from, is an American poster that comes from an online poster campaign, which is reflecting some of the big debates about inequality and class in the United States at the moment. And it kind of poses a question. The middle class is too big to fail. There should be a question mark at the end of that. But I hope that I will, and others will reflect on that issue as we go through. Is the middle class too big to fail? Now, just quickly, a word about definition. I'm going to be talking mainly about the middle income groups rather than the middle class in a British context, i.e., by that I mean the group that's clustered around the middle of the income hierarchy, those very close to the median income, rather than the definition of middle class in the United Kingdom, which tends to be a bit higher than that, tends to be a little bit above. I mean, there is some overlap, but tends to be. So there are differences of definition. I'm going to be sticking closer probably to the US definition. Now, one of the most significant and enduring trends of the 20th century was indeed the rise of the middle. This happened across countries. It's probably started in the United States. And this is quite a famous quote from the sociologist C. Wright Mills in 1956, who said that American society has become less a pyramid with a flat base than a flat diamond with a bulging middle. Now, that description, I think, applies not just to the United States, but pretty well to most rich countries from the mid-1950s onwards. We've had a very similar pattern, and this led to big debates in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s about whether the working class had been subject to this process of embourgeoisement, whether they'd taken on middle-class values and no longer cared about the class struggle. And then, of course, we have the famous phrase from John Prescott, the deputy leader of the Labour Party in 1997, when he said that we're all middle class now. And then, of course, as well as the rich world, this has all spread to the developing world. So we've had the emergence of middle-class communities across most of the developing world, and they are predicted to expand significantly over the next 5 years, probably to take up about half the population of the developing world. Now, this is particularly interesting because just as the middle-class populations are taking off in the developing world, they're beginning to shrink in the developed world. And in the United States, for example, the evidence is that the size of the middle started shrinking as long ago as the late 1970s. Indeed, the evidence suggests that the size of the middle in the United States has probably fallen by about 10 percentage points since the late 1970s. And this is causing a huge debate in the United States, and there's been a wave of books over the last few years about the impact of this shrinking of the middle class on the United States. And I've just put up 3 of the most recent ones that came out in 2012. And there is a similar debate in the UK as well. Other books are coming out. Now, I think the interesting thing is that if we look... Sorry, I went too far on that. If we just take a very, very simple look at what's been happening to class, this is the old traditional definition based upon 5 occupational groups, then it's perfectly clear in the United Kingdom that the middle class has been rising pretty sharply and the working class has been falling pretty sharply, and so the middle class now outstripped, on these definitions, the size of the working class. I think this trend is essentially an illusion. If we classify people by income instead of by their occupational grouping, then you get a very, very different picture. What's basically been happening, people have been moving up in class terms, either been moving from blue-collar jobs to white-collar jobs, but their incomes have not risen to reflect that. In some cases, those incomes of white-collar jobs are actually lower than the jobs that they replaced. And so instead of having a diamond shape now, we probably did have a diamond shape in the 70s and 80s, we now have much more of an hourglass shape. We have a cluster of people at the top, a cluster of people at the bottom, and a very long, thin line of people in the middle. Now, what's caused this shift from the diamond shape to the hourglass shape? Well, the main reason is the compression of wages. That what's been happening over the last 30 years is that the aggregate level of wages by roughly the bottom third or the bottom half of the population has been shrinking quite sharply for two main reasons. The first is that the share of output going to wages has been falling since the late 1970s. It held pretty steady in the immediate post-war decades, and then, as you can see from the graph, it's been falling. But on top of that, there's been a growing gap in wages. This is a graph with an index of 100 in 1978, and this shows the increase in wages over the last 30 years after adjustment for inflation for those at the bottom of the wage hierarchy, those in the middle, the median, and those at the top. And you can see that those in the median have enjoyed wage increases at twice the pace of the bottom 10%, and those at the top have been enjoying wage increases at 4 times that pace. So basically what has been happening is that those at the bottom have been getting a declining share of a diminishing cake. Now, this pattern is replicated across most OECD countries, not all of them. Germany, for example, has had flat wages on average since 2000, and for those below the average, it's actually been falling. Now, what are the consequences of these trends? Well, the first consequence is, of course, is that we've been having rising inequality. This is the United Kingdom looking at the share taken by the top 1%, and it takes the form of a U-curve. So the share taken by the 1% fell consistently from the war from the beginning of the last century until the mid-1970s, and it's been rising back up again. It's nearly back to where we were in the 1930s. And again, this U-shaped curve can be replicated across about 2/3 of OECD countries. And one of the consequences of that is that, of these trends, is that Britain has become a low-wage economy. A fifth, slightly more than a fifth, of the workforce work on low pay. It was about 12% in the 1970s, so it's more or less, it's nearly doubled. We're slightly behind the United States and more or less on a par with Germany here. Now, I probably haven't got time to go into all the consequences, but let me just run through some of the other consequences. The first, these trends are the main explanation as to why we've had this great surge in the level of poverty amongst people in the workforce. So the proportion of the people in poverty who lived in families where somebody was in work 30 years ago was about 30%. Now it's over 60%, so it's doubled. And another consequence of this is that the shrinking middle, the collapse in wages at the bottom, and this concentration of income at the top, is that we have a cap on aspiration. There just are not enough intermediate jobs that are reasonably well paid that enable people to start off in low-paid jobs to progress through the system. So we're having this cap on the possibility of people moving up through the system. Another consequence is that if you actually look at the average income of the bottom fifth of people in the United Kingdom, their average income is lower than the average income of the top 5% in a number of other poor countries. Particularly just to give you some, in Eastern Europe countries, where GDP rates are less than half the United Kingdom. The top fifth in Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, actually have incomes that are higher, significantly higher, it's something like 20%, than the bottom fifth in the UK. And another consequence is that we're having these patterns are having quite a big effect on voting patterns. In the United States, a quarter of the electorate is not even registered. And the evidence is that they're concentrated amongst low-income households. In the United Kingdom, in 1987, the turnout rate between the top quintile and the bottom quintile by income was 4 percentage points. It's quite a small gap. In the 2010 general election, the gap was 23 points. In Germany, something very, very similar. 3/4 of young people under 25 who are on benefits do not vote in Germany. So, coming back to the initial... I've lost that, I think. Coming back to the graph that I started with, the poster about whether the middle class is too big to fail, I think the answer is that the banks are maybe too big to fail, but it appears that the middle class is not. Thank you.
Okay, so Felix, if you'll bear with me one second. So I'm quite curious. So when you talk about sort of cap on aspirations and this, you give the sense that there's maybe less mobility now, or actually you give that sense quite clearly that there's less mobility now than before. So, I mean, would you contest the theme of mobile middle class? Do you think that's actually not what's happened, that there is less mobility? It's not that...
Yeah, I think all the evidence is that there is I mean, what happened in the 1950s and 60s and 70s was that there was a lot of upward absolute social mobility, i.e. that people were moving up the class structure because they were moving up from their parents had been doing working class jobs, they were doing the sort of white collar jobs of different sorts. So there was a general process of upward absolute mobility. That has been petering out probably over the last 15 to 20 years for a variety of reasons, mainly, partly because of this polarization of the jobs market, or what economists call the hollowing out of the middle, and the disappearance of those middle, intermediate, supervisory type jobs that used to enable people to progress gradually through the system. You can see this today. I mean, the banks are shedding managerial jobs. The tube system is about to shed a very large number of supervisory jobs, so one supervisor is going to look after 4 tubes instead of 1 tubes. Right across the board, these jobs in the middle are shrinking. And this is, and if you look at this pattern is particularly affecting young people. The evidence is that, the under 25s, 47% of graduates over the last 18 months who've got jobs are not working in graduate employment. So yes, I think at the moment, if these trends, and what's happened during this polarization process did start easing off a little bit before the recession, but since 2008, it's actually accelerated. So between 2008 and 2012, 70% of the jobs that have been created have been low-paid jobs, and we've lost something like 250,000 middle-income jobs. So this process of polarization, the disappearance in the middle, this chance of progression, is getting worse.
That's clearly a very bleak picture that you're painting. Now, what do you think about this suggestion that was made in the previous presentation that the top class in the UK is maybe a bit more meritocratic or they've gotten there in maybe more meritocratic means. Is that justification for us to be perhaps less upset about rising inequality if people have risen up through meritocratic processes?
Well, I mean, I think the evidence, even if I don't think we do have a meritocratic society, in the sense that I don't think the most able people are getting to the top. I mean, that's partly because our educational system is very, very bad. But even if we had a meritocratic society, many of the people at the top, in the top 1% or the top 0.5%, I mean, the people are earning over, $500,000, particularly if we look at people in the city, there are big question marks. I mean, they justify their high earnings on the basis of, I'm worth it. I'm there because I'm creating wealth, I'm making everybody better off, and I deserve the money I'm getting. The evidence really is that most of the income at the top is rentier income, rather than their incomes are the product of using their economic muscle to grab a bigger share of the cake, rather than to create a bigger cake from which the rest of us benefit. Now, if that was the case, if it was all down to wealth creation, hard work, taking risks with their own money, wealth creation, traditional entrepreneurship, then you might defend the kind of scale of wealth there is at the top. But I think the evidence is that certainly, compared, say, with the 19th century, the big last wealth boom at the end of the 19th century, was more meritocratic. It was more deserved. Very little of the wealth boom of the last 25 years is beneficial in that sense. Probably controversial, this.
Yes, go.
I think that's absolutely right. But the meritocratic theme, I think, is interesting in two ways. Objectively, if you look at the elite class or the very wealthy, all the indicators are that they are much more likely to come from privileged backgrounds. How we measure that than, say, the comfortably off middle class beneath them. So in that respect, we are talking about the reproduction of forms of inequality. At the same time, I think what's also important is that they don't feel they are just a ascribed upper class. They feel they have to demonstrate, they have to kind of earn it. So I think it's a different cultural attitude, which they would, I think, tend to see as meritocratic, even though, actually, when you look at the data, indeed they tend to be coming from privileged backgrounds. So I think it's a kind of mismatch between people's own perceptions of why they're there and how they actually manage to get there.
And okay, so on and then we'll pass it to Felix. On this, I think it's quite interesting, the juxtapositions between these two presentations. One of which that looks very much in terms of people's perceptions of class, and also these questions of the extent to which you perform class, or you look for markers to help you understand where you fit in society. And then the second presentation, which is maybe you could a bit more of a sort of clinical examination of wealth, poverty, and inequality. What do you learn from each other by putting those two together? How interested are you in perceptions of class, how people position themselves, Stewart? And Mike, how interested are you in the very sort of clinical, let's put it on a graph?
Well, I think the perceptions are extremely interesting because, there's been a lot of work done which has asked people, for example, where they position themselves in the income hierarchy. And the evidence is the only people who get it right are the bottom 20%. They get it pretty right. The people who get it least right are the people at the very top. So people on very, very high incomes in the top 1% actually think they're near the middle. In other words, and this has big implications, if the rich feel poor for the way societies function. I think there is a lot of misconception about, where they stand, and that's lots of reasons for that, but there certainly is a lot of misconception.
And I'm very interested in the patterns and the economic contours, which I think have been very nicely laid out. But I think I would say that what we need to do is recognise those economic inequalities, and then ask the question: well, are these forming? What are the social divisions which are based upon those economic inequalities? And what I think, the data from the BBC survey is showing in quite intriguing ways is that this very wealthy group at the top, which we characterise as elite, but you might also call them the super wealthy or whatever, they're not just an economic sector. They are actually also forming as a kind of a group with certain kind of shared outlooks, shared values. Let me give an example from our data, that if you ask the people in our so-called elite class, the top 5%, about their social networks, 80% of that group, they know socially a chief executive officer. 75% of them know socially a chief finance officer. So they know people like themselves. They are well connected to that kind of business class. If you say, do you know a bus driver? Less than 10%. Do you know a factory worker? Less than 10%. So I think what we need to do, and what we need to understand is actually these aren't just economic divisions, they also deeply mark the way we see society and the way we kind of interact with people. So the worrying thing is that these very wealthy people, as you say, they don't think of themselves as wealthy. They think of themselves as ordinary people, which is living a nice lifestyle, without recognising actually that in fact it's a bubble which only a very small portion of the population recognise and can share. So it's not as if, going back to the comic sketch, people are looking up and looking down and recognising that. It's actually much more insular, I think.